This is a 2025 11-inch iPad lineup, and while all these look quite similar to each other and the versions before them, looks can be deceiving. Apple recently updated their regular iPad and iPad Air, which, to be honest, aren't a whole lot different than the models before them, but there are some important upgrades in each of them that do create more of an overlap between these models and the current iPad Pro. That can make it harder to pick the right iPad, and my goal is to try and clear that up a little and go over what you can expect to get out of each of them, where things have improved in these newer models, and break down when it makes sense to choose one of these over the other. Let's get into it. Hey everyone, Kyle Erickson here. This week I picked up both new iPads to review, and the trouble with trying to review these on their own is there's just not a whole lot to go over in a standalone review. The new base iPad and iPad Air both got chip bumps with some minor upgrades that you might notice depending on what you do, which we're going to get into, but if you were to stick these new models side by side with their predecessors, they look virtually identical. The new iPad A16 and M3 iPad Air have the exact same form factor as before, where you've got the same dimensions with the same size and color options. The A16 iPad only has one size in silver, blue, pink, and yellow choices, with the one that I have here being blue, and these are really the only vibrant color options you'll have in any iPad, as the Air has a much more muted pastel palette, with space gray, starlight, purple, and blue in 11 or 13-inch sizes, and the Pro doesn't really have any colors, with only space black and silver options offered in 11 and 13 inches as well. I've got both 11-inch starlight and space gray Airs here, and the Pro that I've got is space black, and outside of whatever your color preference is, from the front to the back, these really don't look all that different size-wise, and even the weight is similar, where the regular iPad is the heaviest at 477 grams, the Air is 460, and the M4 iPad Pro is 444, but the thickness is the thing that really sets these apart. The iPad Pro is only 5.3 millimeters thick, while the iPad Air is 6 mils and the A17 iPad is 7, which is a considerable difference, and on the base iPad specifically, a lot of that has to do with the display. Unlike the other two models here, the regular iPad does not have a laminated display, meaning that the display panel and the touchscreen are not fused together. That not only means that this is a little bit thicker, but it also increases the distance between the pencil and the display panel. So if you're buying an iPad specifically for drawing, this probably isn't the one that you want to choose. Not just because of that, but also because the display on here isn't quite as color accurate, as the A16 iPad only covers the sRGB color gamut, where the Air and the Pro cover the P3 gamut, which is a much wider color spectrum. But if all you're doing is taking notes, or your kids are just using it for fun, this is still totally fine. In fact, even for watching media and web browsing, unless you're looking for it, it doesn't really look all that much different than the Air. The black levels on this A16 iPad are a little bit higher than on the Air, so it won't have as good a contrast at times and can look a little bit flatter, but funny enough, sometimes you can see a little more detail in the shadows on the A16 iPad. They both have the exact same brightness with a max brightness of 500 nits, and to really see a big jump in screen quality, you'll want to move up to the Pro, which blows these two out of the water. Unlike the iPad and iPad Air, which have 60Hz IPS LCD panels, the Pro has a tandem OLED XDR 120Hz ProMotion panel with deep inky blacks, colors that pop, and has double the brightness specs in SDR content, but also supports HDR content with up to 1600 nits peak brightness. The regular iPad and iPad Air don't support HDR at all, so any media that supports HDR, which will predominantly be TV shows and movies, will look a lot better and have much better contrast. Likewise, games and anything with a lot of movement will look better on the Pro, with it having a higher refresh rate, and because the screen is much brighter, it's much more visible in daylight. Speaking of visibility, the A16 iPad is the only device here that doesn't have an anti-reflective coating, and that coating can make a considerable difference in areas with a lot of brightness. The regular iPad is still totally usable in bright spots where you get some reflection, and putting a screen protector on any of these can both heighten or reduce glare depending on which type you get, but on the Pro, you also have one other choice where if you upgrade to a model with 1 or 2 terabytes of storage, you have the option of going with a nano texture finish that will often completely remove reflections. Just be aware that that can add a bit of softness to your image, which some folks don't like. I'm one of those people, so I would definitely take a look at it in store first before choosing it. Also, in regards to putting on a screen protector, putting one of those on, especially a thicker glass one, will increase the distance between the display and the pencil, which isn't always desirable, and these models do have varying degrees of Apple Pencil support as well. All 3 of these will support the USB-C Apple Pencil, but only the Pro and Air models will support the Apple Pencil Pro, and there are some notable differences between the two. The Pro Pencil has features like pressure sensitivity, wireless charging, advanced touch controls, barrel roll, and Find My, where the USB-C Pencil does not. So for someone who is doing a lot of artwork or using the pencil a lot, the Pencil Pro is really what I'd lean into. That being said, these are quite pricey, with the Pencil Pro coming in at $130 USD or 170 Canadian, and the USB-C version will run you 80 USD or 110 Canadian. And if you plan on buying a third-party pencil to save some money, just be aware that the magnets in the new iPads prevent almost all of those from staying attached to the iPads themselves. So they'll still work, you just won't be able to attach them, but they are much more affordable. The other side of using an iPad for artwork, graphic design, or really anything creative is performance, because some creative apps can take up a lot of system resources, and this is where the lines start to blur a little more between each of these models, especially with the upgrades in the new releases. If you go back a couple of generations, it used to be that the regular iPad couldn't handle apps like Affinity Photo or Lightroom, but you can get quite a lot out of the A16 in the base model iPad. That A16 chip is the same one that's in the iPhone 15 with some slight variations. First of all, I believe this is the first Apple Silicon chip to be manufactured in the USA and not in Asia, which is a pretty big deal, but from a technical standpoint, you've also got one less CPU core and one less GPU core over the A16 in the iPhone 15. That means that this is marginally less powerful, where it scores about 6% lower in benchmarks than the iPhone 15, but the RAM on this iPad has doubled from the previous gen, going from 3 gigs to 6, and performs roughly 30% faster than its predecessor. Only having 6 gigs means that the A16 iPad won't run Apple Intelligence where all the other iPad models will, but that really isn't saying much at the moment, given that there's not a whole lot that's useful in Apple AI, and the A16 iPad still runs almost everything outside of video editing fine, which I'll get into in a minute, but any games from the Apple Arcade run well, and even more demanding titles, for the most part, play without any issues. It also stays relatively cool while doing anything resource intensive, as do all these models for that matter, and just for casual use between web browsing, productivity, some lighter creative stuff, and mobile gaming, the A16 iPad does just fine. Now, if you want to do more with your iPad that's outside of just casual use, the Air is the next logical step, and it's a huge step forward in terms of performance. The M3 in here comes packed with an 8-core CPU and 9-core GPU, hardware-accelerated ray tracing, and 8 gigs of RAM, so you're getting what's basically a desktop-class chip that performs about 12 to 15% better than the M2 from last year. I would say that most of the time, the bump from the M2 to the M3 isn't really perceivable. This cuts through pretty much any task with virtually no lag, gaming is smooth regardless of the game, and it does enable things like basic video editing and stuff like 3D modeling software, which the A16 iPad either struggles with or simply can't do. With video editing in particular, a lot of that has to do with the Air having a dedicated media engine, and the M3 Air does have a subtle change over the M2 Air from last year, where it's added ProRes encode and decode engines and AV1 decoding, which lines this up with the M4 iPad Pro. And I gotta say, performance-wise, you're really not gaining much with the M4 iPad Pro over the M3 Air unless you really bump up the specs. The M4 and the iPad Pro essentially has two different versions. There's one with slightly less power, which is what you get if you choose a model with 256 or 512 gigs of storage. That has a 9-core CPU and 10-core GPU with 8 gigs of RAM, and the models with 1 terabyte and above get a 10-core CPU and 10-core GPU with 16 gigs of RAM. The lower-end M4, which is what I have here, is only slightly more powerful than the M3 and the Air, but again, nothing that's perceivable at all when you're actually using it, and because the media engine is now matching between these machines, they feel almost exactly the same. Both are fine for simple video editing, basic timelines with minimal effects, even at 4K resolutions are smooth in both DaVinci Resolve and Final Cut Pro, but for any kind of serious lifting where you plan on using your iPad for editing in more of a professional setting, the 1 terabyte Pros will work a lot better. Those higher spec iPad Pros will only have marginally better chip performance that, again, you'd likely only notice running benchmarks, but the big difference here is that 16 gigs of RAM that's going to enable you to do a lot more with demanding apps like Resolve, and I think Apple's choice to only put 16 gigs of RAM in 1 terabyte and above models makes sense, given that you'll likely only need that much memory if you're doing things on a higher storage device. Speaking of higher storage, the A16 iPad now has a minimum of 128 gigs of space on the base machine, where the previous generation was 64, which is a lot more usable and doesn't come with a price hike, which is nice. You can increase that to 256 or 512 gigs if you'd like, and similarly with the iPad Air, you've got the same storage options as the A16 iPad with an added 1 terabyte option, and the Pro starts at 256 and goes up to 2 terabytes in the same increments. Just to be aware that increasing storage heavily affects the price in some cases, and you do always have the option of adding on to the storage with an external drive, as these do all have USB-C ports that will support external accessories, but you'll get different speeds for each model. The A16 iPad tops out at 480 megabits per second, which is quite slow, and I would say is really only useful if you're hooking up a keyboard or mouse, or offloading files where you really don't care how long they take to transfer. The M3 Air gets bumped up to 10 gigabits, which is roughly 20 times faster and is a lot more usable. Not just with quick transfer speeds, but you can actually edit videos straight off external SSDs with it, and the iPad Pro is on another level as it supports Thunderbolt 4 capable of 40 gigabits per second, which in some cases will run faster than the internal storage on these iPads. All these ports also have DisplayPort functionality, meaning that you can hook these up to external monitors and use them. The regular iPad supports one display up to 4K at 60 Hz, where the previous version could only do 4K at 30 Hz, but the A16 will only mirror your iPad screen, where the Air and Pro models will actually extend them using Stage Manager, and that will give you more of a desktop experience. That can be really useful for video editing, productivity, and just giving the feeling of a desktop, but beyond that, it's also great for watching media at full resolution where you've got a little more control over the regular iPad. Say, if you want to watch Netflix in a hotel or something, which you can do with an HDMI adapter, and the Air and Pro will also support an external display up to 6K at 60 Hz. So you get a bit of a bump there as well, where you can use the full resolution of a studio display if you want to. As far as wireless connectivity goes, the regular iPad does come with Wi-Fi 6 and Bluetooth 5.3, and doesn't feel a whole lot different than the Air or Pro that both have the same version of Bluetooth and slightly better Wi-Fi with Wi-Fi 6E, which does produce marginally better speeds. Nothing I'd be overly concerned with. They're all gonna stream media fine, download files and games equally as good, and video calls feel largely the same as far as network connectivity and camera quality goes, where all the front-facing cameras have 12 megapixel sensors with similar pictures, and the rear cameras, for the most part, are identical. To me, that makes sense given that the rear cameras aren't likely going to get used much. There are some discrepancies, like the M4 iPad Pro being able to record video in ProRes and being the only model with a portrait mode in the camera app. And the A16 iPad doesn't let in quite as much light on the front camera as the other two, but the biggest difference to me lies in the audio, where the A16 and M3 iPad Air both have a 2-mic array, and the M4 iPad has a 4-mic studio quality array where you can notice a difference in quality, but by and large, these will all be perfectly fine for most things. This is what the A16 iPad looks like and sounds like. This is what the M3 iPad Air looks like and sounds like. And this is what the M4 iPad Pro looks like and sounds like. The external audio, I would say, has a bigger disparity, where the regular iPad and iPad Air have landscape stereo speakers that sound pretty good overall, but the M4 iPad Pro has 4 built-in speakers that sound incredible, especially considering how thin it is. That might give the Pro another slight edge over the others for watching media or playing games, on top of the benefits you already get with a better display. And outside of that, there really isn't a whole lot of difference between these iPads. The battery life is largely the same between each of them, where Apple advertises that you can get 9 to 10 hours of media playback and web browsing on each of them. The iPad Pro also has a LiDAR scanner, which can be kinda fun to play around with, and outside of the iPads themselves, there are some differences with accessories, where each model will have different keyboard cases available, but I think the Pro model is the only one where I'd likely buy an Apple-branded keyboard case. The reason I say that is, these are all super expensive. For the standard iPad, which is priced at $349 USD, you're looking at $249 for the Magic Folio case, which isn't far off from the cost of the iPad, and the new iPad Air Magic keyboard, which I should mention is backwards compatible with the M2 iPad Air, is $269, where the base iPad Air costs $599, and if you throw in a pencil as well, you're really hiking up that cost. I've had this third-party case that I've had for the Air that's only a fraction of that cost, and sure, it's not as seamless of an experience, but it still works just fine, and I've had zero issues with it so far. But the Magic Keyboard for the iPad Pro at $299 USD is by far the most well-built out of the bunch, with a full aluminum build, and is a lot easier to justify when you're spending a minimum of $1,000 on an iPad. I think if you're buying the Pro, it is much better suited for using in a professional setting, so it probably makes more sense to spend more on gear, but I could totally see why you might just choose it for the better display, because it does make a world of difference. Having said that, it is almost twice the cost of the Air, and if you're fine with the regular Liquid Retina display in the Air, which really is a great display in its own right, you can do almost everything that you can on the Pro, which I think is probably the sweet spot for a lot of creative folks who are going to use their iPad for drawing or photo editing and things of that nature. And if all you're doing is using your iPad around the house, or you're just using it for basic things like watching content or browsing the web, the A16 iPad is more than enough for most folks. All of this just depends on how you plan on using your iPad and which of these features are important to you and what you're willing to spend. And maybe none of these make sense and you'd rather buy an M4 MacBook Air, which I also might be currently looking at. But I think Apple has done a good job at giving you a fairly broad selection of choices. With that said, I know that I've probably missed some things with these because there is a lot to each of these devices, so please drop a comment down below if you want to add on to anything here, but that's all I have for you today. I hope you found this video useful or enjoyable. If you did, feel free to hit that like button. If you'd like to see more tech-related content, or help me design a 3D print of a statue of your Wi-Fi router as a tribute to its service, please subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next upload.